Hello, I am Maya Ajmera, President and CEO of the Society for Science and publisher of Science News. Welcome to the Society for Science's signature event. We have an extraordinary program for you today, one that I'm excited to share with an audience that spans our programs and the globe. I've been looking forward to today's conversation for weeks, and I will be talking to Dr. Raj Chetty, the William A. Ackman Professor of Economics at Harvard University and Director of Opportunity Insights, which uses big data to study the science of economic opportunity, namely, how can we give children of all backgrounds better chances of succeeding? Today, Raj and I will be digging into his work, both his research into the lost Einsteins, which finds that because of inequality, the US has potentially missed out on millions of inventors, and his research on the impact of social capital. Raj received his BA and PhD in economics from Harvard University in 2003 and is one of the youngest tenured professors in Harvard's history. Before joining the faculty at Harvard, he was professor at UC Berkeley and Stanford University. Raj has received numerous awards for his research, including a MacArthur Fellowship and the John Bates Clark Medal given to the economist under 40 whose work is judged to have made the most significant contribution to the field. I'm also very proud to share that Raj is an alum of two of the Society's world-class STEM competitions, the International Science and Engineering Fair, the world's largest pre-collegiate STEM competition in the world, as well as the Science Talent Search, the nation's most prestigious science and math competition for high school seniors. For those of you who may be new to the Society for Science, I'd like to briefly introduce you to our work. In addition to our exceptional high school competitions, the Society is known for the Broadcom Masters, the nation's premier middle school STEM competition. At the end of the month, the Broadcom Masters finalists will be gathering in Washington, D.C. to compete in team challenges and to share their research with our judges. I encourage everyone to visit the Broadcom Masters Virtual Science and Engineering Project Showcase, which we will launch October 29th. Each of these middle school finalists is working to find solutions to our world's most intractable challenges. The Society is also known for our accurate, objective, award-winning journalism in Science News and Science News Explorers, which covers subjects ranging from neuroscience to astrophysics to today's topic of economic mobility. Science News was co-founded more than 100 years by newspaper magnate E.W. Scripps as a means to fight back against misinformation, an issue we are sadly still contending with today. The Society also has a number of outreach and equity programs aimed at ensuring that every child who wants to be a scientist or engineer has the opportunity to do so. And it is because of this work that I feel our organization is so closely linked to the important research that Raj is conducting. Through our programming, the Society provides teachers and underserved communities with professional development STEM opportunities and grant support for their classrooms, supports teachers to become mentors and advocates for their students so they can participate in scientific research and science competitions, builds scientific literacy by placing science news in classrooms around the country for millions of young people, and a community of nearly 20,000 STEM teachers who use science news in their classroom as a teaching tool. And lastly, we invest in grassroots STEM nonprofits, enabling them to help people of all ages become more engaged in STEM. Our bottom line goal is to ensure that there are no more lost Einsteins, that students everywhere have ample resources in their classrooms and teachers who are well-trained to guide them through scientific research and discovery. What's more, by bringing together students from around the country and around the world through our competitions, we help foster critical social connections. We know that young people who meet during our competitions encourage each other to persist, reconnect in college, and even launch companies together. I'm truly looking forward to learning more from Raj today and hearing how we can all do more to expand access. One final housekeeping item before we begin. As I hope you all enjoyed taking our economic mobility quiz leading up to today's event. It's incredible to see what data can show about access in our communities. Of our quiz participants, 3 attendees correctly answered every question. I want to congratulate Patty Schillenberg, Samed, Alizadu, and Henry Yao. Our alumni team will reach out to you after today's event about your quiz prize. Now let's get started. So, Raj, tell us about yourself and a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah, so first, let me just say, Maya, what a pleasure it is to join you and join everyone at this event. It's really a privilege and an honor having participated in ISEF many years ago and so on. And so my own upbringing, goes back to growing up in India and New Delhi till I was 9 years old, and then coming to the United States with my parents, and had, I think, what is a common experience for many immigrant kids, seeing the US as really a land of opportunity. Remember being in India thinking that just coming to the US would be a dream and open up so many doors. And I came from a family that has a background in science and medicine and so on. So I had some exposure to that way of thinking and interest in those fields. But seeing the big contrast between India and the United States, I think has shaped some of my perspective and interest in issues of inequality and social mobility and opportunity in my own career.
Raj, where did you grow up in the United States?
So we moved around a bit. I went to high school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a school called University School of Milwaukee. And from there, I ended up coming to Harvard, and have mostly been in Boston, East and West Coast from that point.
So part of your first years in the US included competing in 2 of our science competitions, the International Science and Engineering Fair and the Science Talent Search. What do you remember about your research and competing in these competitions?
Yeah, so I have vivid memories actually of participating in those competitions. So the way I got involved was through my high school, where there were a number of students who participated in these competitions. It was a college prep school in Milwaukee, focused on things like science and so on. And then I had an opportunity to work at the Medical College of Wisconsin in a microbiology lab during the summers and after school. And so I developed a project there that I then used in the International Science and Engineering Fair. And I remember, I think the year I was a senior, the competition was in Louisville, Kentucky. And so I went to Louisville with some friends, got to meet lots of different people. And I remember, being really struck by the experience of seeing all these students from different parts of the United States doing lots of different exciting things. And it was certainly something that whole process, including that event, shaped, I think, my own interest in research and the types of questions I'm focused on today.
So you do believe that competitions like this did influence your trajectory, right, into this idea of academic research, but more specifically on opportunity. You're considered one of the preeminent economists of our time. What inspired you to apply big data to the study of economic mobility?
Yeah, so just maybe tying it back a bit to the experience in participating in the science fairs in high school, I think I started to realize that I was very interested in research and science and discovering things. But at the same time, it was also a very informative experience in the sense that I realized I was more interested in statistics and math than in pipetting and the detailed work in a microbiology lab, which of course is incredibly important, but just didn't feel like as much of my thing. And so that's, I think part of what you can learn from these kinds of experiences, both positively to be inspired, but also to get a better sense of your own interests. And so given that interest in math and statistics and some of the background I had of seeing these vast differences in outcomes, it seemed, between kids who were in India, some of my cousins who didn't have the same opportunities that I happened to have, I began to wonder, would there be a way to put those things together, to combine an interest in statistics and math with thinking about these kinds of social problems? And so that naturally drew me towards economics and social science. And big data came later, because at the time that I was in college and in graduate school, big data wasn't a thing about 20 years ago. But it became a vehicle to start to study some of these questions. And that's part of what I've developed in my own research.
So you have researched a range of variables that both coincide with and challenge our perceptions of economic mobility and the American dream. What findings in your research have surprised you the most?
So I would say at the highest level, what surprised me is how the US really is not so much of a land of opportunity, despite the perception, I think, both within the United States and globally, that this is really the country you should come to if you want to rise up. And in a way, I think that's been surprising and somewhat disappointing to see in the data that, especially for the present generation, your odds, if you're growing up as a kid in the US, especially a kid in a low income family, of reaching up into the middle class or beyond or doing better than your parents really don't look all that great. And in particular, don't look as good as if you were growing up in Canada or in many European countries. You know, in some sense, if you want to achieve the American dream, you're better off, looks like in the data, growing up in Canada or in many parts of Scandinavia than the US. And so at the highest level, I think that surprised me. And then starting to dig in further into the data and understanding how disparate opportunities are, depending upon where you're growing up in the US, what the color of your skin is, you know, the dramatic differences in economic mobility between Black and white Americans, and so on. And so I think there are a number of puzzling findings that challenge narratives we all often have in our minds. And part of what I'm focused on trying to do is sort of restore reality to what we actually have as, I think, our aspirations in the United States by figuring out the determinants of economic opportunity.
So can I go back one step for those who are listening in the audience? Talk about these big data sets for a second. Where do they come from? How long, how did you come upon them? And how did you think about these questions that have been, bothering you, right? And looking at these big data sets, how did that kind of come together for you? So answer first, where did these big data sets come from? Second, how did your questions, and then how does that merge?
Yeah. So just to step back a bit and contextualize, so economics traditionally has been a pretty theoretical field, or a field with pretty limited data, right? So we've been at the level of comparing, macroeconomic patterns look very different in the US versus the UK versus Canada. And what can we learn from that? Well, it's very tricky to learn from that because there are tons of things that are different about the United States versus England versus Canada. You just have a very limited number of data points. So where does big data come in? Big data gives us the power to, I think of it as sort of an analogy to the microscope. It lets us zoom in and look at the same kinds of questions, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city, block by block in America, really disaggregate the picture and try to understand why are kids doing much better in one part of the US versus the other, and how can we learn from that? So now, to make it concrete, where is this data actually coming from? So one important source of data is information from anonymized tax returns. So when you file your taxes, you probably think of that as just some obligation you have to do to kind of settle your bill with the government. And that is the basic purpose of our tax system. But it leaves a digital trail that can be incredibly useful for social science research. In particular, because from tax records, we have detailed information on everyone's incomes. We can link people to their parents. We can see where they were living as children. We can link other data to these tax data. So for example, we've linked the universe of patent records to the tax data. So you can see everyone who's become an inventor in America and how that relates to their family background, parental income, where they went to school, things like that. And so you can see how that kind of information, I should emphasize, all carefully privacy protected and anonymized. It's not that we're looking at any individual's tax returns. This is all being aggregated in an anonymized way to protect privacy. That can give us an incredibly granular look into how do your prospects of becoming an inventor vary if you go to Caltech versus Harvard, depending upon the college you attend, the neighborhood in which you grow up, and so forth. And so it's that kind of information, plus other data sets like Facebook data on social networks, other sorts of information that are really revolutionizing our ability to study social science questions.
Wow. And so you have this big data that came to play. Can you just explain at the beginning of your research, right? Were you asking specific questions, or was it, my goodness, aha, through this data, we're seeing some trends. Can you explain that piece a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So about 10 or 15 years ago, I was interested in these issues of inequality and so on, and I had been using smaller data sets, doing more theoretical work, but I really felt like I wanted to get a more concrete sense of how things actually worked in the world. And I had the sense that if we could get access to something like tax records, and this was just a thought at the time, that could revolutionize the field and give us tremendous precision. And so, as you can imagine, it was quite complicated to get access to those data. People hadn't really used them systematically for this sort of research, lots of legal issues to be worked out and so forth. Eventually, we managed to overcome a lot of those hurdles and get access to the data. And it was just sort of being in an open field where there are all these possibilities. Nobody's really used the data. Are they high quality? What kinds of questions can you really study with them? And so the way I looked at it when we first got access to the data is sort of on two dimensions. It seemed to me like we would be able to do long-term studies that people had never been able to do before. So if you think about the very first question we actually set about to answer is, how does your kindergarten teacher affect how much you're earning when you're 30 years old? So if you think about trying to answer that question traditionally, you'd have to track thousands of kids from age 5 to age 30, which would be incredibly difficult to do with any normal approach, any traditional approach. And so it seemed to me like this would be a way to demonstrate to scientists, to the public, the value of this sort of data if we could actually pull that off. So that was one dimension. And then another dimension was the ability to zoom in to specific subgroups. So to look at one neighborhood versus another neighborhood and see how kids' outcomes were varying across those places. And so we basically said, let's try to do these two projects, linking data from something called the Tennessee STAR experiment, which randomly assigned kids to different classrooms in the 1980s. But nobody had been able to do a long-term follow-up of that study. And we were able to link that data to tax records and look at how those kids were doing 25 years later. And so that once we saw that that could work, that completely opened things up and led to lots of possibilities.
That's brilliant. Amazing. And getting through all the loopholes and all the hurdles around to get to those data sets, right? I can't even imagine how hard that was, frankly, with the bureaucracy. But it's now become a goldmine in terms of really studying about opportunity. There's a question from Natasha Cabrera, professor at University of Maryland, who submitted a question to us. For whom is the American dream possible, Raj?
That's a great question, Natasha. So I would say in simple terms, at the moment, for white Americans growing up in certain communities, often higher income areas with better schools, better social networks, you see that kids growing up in middle-class families have pretty good outcomes. For Black kids, unfortunately, and Black boys in particular, the American dream really is not a reality almost anywhere in the US. For immigrants, we continue to see pretty good outcomes for kids who come here as immigrants, but there are vast swaths of America, many parts of the United States, much of the Southeast, many cities in the industrial Midwest, where even white kids, don't have great chances of rising up.
Your most recent research highlights the importance of forging relationships that transcend socioeconomic status. Can you tell us about those findings?
Yeah. So the way we came about focusing on this area of research, looking at social capital and social connections as a potential determinant of economic opportunity, is that we had seen for several years that, as I was just saying, there are vast differences in children's chances of rising up across different communities. And so that sort of became a motivating puzzle to us to organize our research in our lab at Harvard, asking, what factors can we find that explain why in certain parts of Iowa, we're seeing kids growing up in low-income families do really well? Is it about the schools? Is it about the types of jobs? Is it about other things? And many sociologists had kind of discussed over the years the idea that it might be about who you're connected to, who you're inspired by, who shapes your aspirations, what your network looks like, that could be important, broadly placed under the umbrella of social capital. But the problem was traditionally, like with a lot of other issues in social science, we didn't really have a good way to measure social capital. If you think about trying to collect data on everyone's friends, something like the tax records is not going to really help you there, right? And so with the advent of online social networks, I actually started talking with folks at Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg in particular about the possibility of launching a large-scale collaboration between Meta and our research team to study these questions in much greater detail than had ever been done in the past. And what we were able to do is use Facebook social network data on 80 million people and look at their friendships in the US, 21 billion friendships between them, and construct very fine-grained measures, zip code by zip code in America, of about the extent to which low and high income people were interacting with each other. And it turns out, Maya, that's the single strongest predictor of differences in economic mobility that we or anybody else has identified to date. So to put it in simple terms, if you as a low-income kid grow up in a community where there's a lot of interaction across class lines, you have much better chances of going to college, going on to achieve a higher level of income, maybe becoming a scientist, things like that. And it remains to be understood exactly what the mechanisms are for that, but we think it's things like who is shaping your aspirations? Are you aware of career paths that you may not otherwise have considered, where you're now connected to somebody whose parents are scientists, doctors, lawyers, where previously, if you were living in a disconnected community, that just wasn't even on the radar screen.
Raj, I have a good friend who came to this country, poor, couldn't speak English, went to public school, but somehow innately knew she needed to attach herself to those that were aspiring high, that were in the right clubs, that were really working hard. She just latched onto them. And I remember her telling me that. She was like, for some reason, I knew that was my way out. And she went on to Stanford, and the rest is history, right? I'm very curious about this idea of social capital, right? You can also look at LinkedIn, right? And see who links into whom and why, right? What is, from a policy standpoint, but even from an individual standpoint, to a parent, what would your advice be based on this research?
Yeah. So one piece of nuance that I would note, and something we've learned from doing this research, is often when people think about networks, and you mentioned LinkedIn, people often think about direct job referrals and connections that, if I'm connected to somebody who's higher income, they can help me get a job at a company that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to get. And that, of course, could well be at play. But what actually seems more important is where you grow up as a kid. So we've shown in particular that if you move to one of these more connected neighborhoods, when you're 2 instead of 5 or 5 instead of 10, there's sort of a dosage effect. Every extra year that you spend growing up as a child in one of these more connected areas improves your outcomes 20 years later. So, of course, you're not getting job referrals when you're 7 years old, right? It's about a different mechanism, about how it's shaping your outlook and so forth. And so I think the message from that kind of finding for policy and for parents is that we need to think very hard, not just about the traditional resources that policy in this area is usually focused on. So, do we expand funding for Head Start or for schools or for this kind of program or that kind of program? That can obviously be very important. But what we're finding in this study and many other related studies is that the element of social support on top of those resources, helping people actually use those resources effectively, is extremely important. So in other words, giving access to everyone to the science fair is a first very valuable step, but then actually creating the connections so that kids, especially from more disadvantaged backgrounds who may not have science in their family, have kind of a pathway to feel like I belong here and this is something I can pursue. I think that really makes a big difference.
But I'm going to throw sort of a ball into this, just to have this social connectedness, right? If you're aspiring to that as a parent, saying, I want to give my kid the best opportunity, I want to live in this neighborhood or in this sort of community, there are barriers to that, right? There's affordable housing, there's playing out racism. There's a lot of things that has to go right for that to happen. Am I correct in assuming that, Raj?
That's exactly right. And in fact, we've done some research exactly getting at that issue. So one way in which you might give people access to better opportunities is by, as you said, helping them move to communities that are more connected, that have better schools, and so on. And there are big programs in the US where we spend about $45 billion per year actually on affordable housing programs that are intended to give families access to such neighborhoods. So in some recent work we've done in collaboration with the Seattle Housing Authority, we found that despite the fact that many families are getting thousands of dollars a year of rental assistance from the federal government in the form of housing vouchers to move to better neighborhoods, they're not actually using that money to move to higher opportunity areas. They're living in neighborhoods where we see in our data, kids are unlikely to escape poverty in the next generation. So we began to wonder, why is it that we're spending billions of dollars on trying to solve this problem, but it's not actually working? And it comes back in a way, Maya, to exactly the conversation we've been having. We ran a randomized trial, very much like you would in a traditional natural science setting, inspired by that line of thinking. We took 1,000 families who came in to apply for housing vouchers in Seattle, and 500 of them we randomly selected. We gave them additional assistance to move to a high opportunity neighborhood if they wanted to do so. So what was this assistance? Things like having a broker who would connect you to landlords who might be willing to rent you their apartment in a higher opportunity place, people who would drive you around and help you navigate the process and connect you with people who had already made that move so you didn't feel like a total outsider moving to a place that you were unfamiliar with. And it turns out this relatively simple intervention dramatically changes where people choose to live. We change the fraction of people who live in high opportunity neighborhoods from 15% in the control group up to 55 or 60% in the treatment group. So you fundamentally change where people choose to live, importantly, without much additional expense to the government. And so that's an example of how we can take a scientific approach to addressing the type of question you just raised. And it has really important practical impact. So after what we did in Seattle, the federal government is now replicating what we did in Seattle in 9 other cities across the United States. And there's now a bill working its way through Congress to expand the housing voucher program by $5 billion per year to increase the number of families eligible for these supports and also structure the program in a way with these social connections that will actually make it more effective. So, that was a long answer. The short summary is that I think there are important barriers, but they can actually be addressed, and scientific thinking can help us solve those kinds of problems.
Absolutely. Oh, that's brilliant. At the Society for Science, we seek to ensure that every child who wants to become a scientist or engineer has the opportunity to do so if that's what they choose. How can we, continue to encourage diverse relationships through educational programming and programming that serves underrepresented communities?
Yeah, I think groups like the Society for Science have an incredibly important role to play in the type of mission you just described. I think the way I think about it is from this work on lost Einsteins, which you mentioned in your introductory remarks. What is that idea? So we see in this data where we've linked the patent records to the tax records that you are much more likely to become an inventor in America as measured by having a patent if you're from a high-income family, if you're white, and if you're male. And in particular, this idea of lost Einsteins that we document is if lower-income kids, women, and kids from underrepresented minority backgrounds were to invent at the same rate as high-income white men, we'd have 4 times as many scientists and inventors in America today as we currently do, right? And so why is that happening? Digging into the data further, we see that if we look early in children's childhood, we see that kids from these other underrepresented backgrounds, lower income families, women, and so on, if you look at measures like quantitative aptitude, how well you're doing on your 3rd grade math test, for example, their scores don't look all that different from kids from higher income backgrounds. But what is very different is if you take 2 kids who are at the top of their 3rd grade math class and say one is white and one is black, or one is from a high income family, one is from a lower income family, if you're at the top of your 3rd grade math class, you're much more likely to become an inventor in the US but only if you're from a high-income white family. So that is to say, at present in the US, it looks like in order to become an inventor, you need two things. You need to be smart and you need to be from a rich family. And that latter, of course, is something that is not desirable from a social perspective and is something that I think groups like the Society for Science can tackle. And what is the mechanism to tackling that? I think it comes back to exposure. So we find that kids who grow up in communities where there are more inventors are much more likely to become inventors themselves. But importantly, that's in a very specific exposure-dependent mechanism. So for instance, girls are much more likely to become inventors if there are more female scientists in a particular field in their area. If there are more male scientists, it actually has no impact at all. And so to me, that points to a mechanism which is you need to see somebody whose shoes you can kind of see yourself in, right? It's not enough to just see science kind of generally happening around you. Another example of that is we find the exact field in which people go on to invent is very closely related to what they were exposed to while they were growing up. So if you take two kids who are currently in Boston, let's say they're at MIT, and one grew up in Minneapolis and one grew up in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, of course, has a lot of computer innovation. Minneapolis, you might not know, has a lot of medical device companies.
That's right.
Turns out if you look in the data, and you can do this in a very granular way, the kid from Minneapolis is much more likely to have a patent in medical devices, even though they're both currently in Boston, 15, 20 years later. And the kid from Silicon Valley is much more likely to have a patent in computers. So all of that shows you that what you're exposed to as you're growing up really matters. And kids from lower income backgrounds often aren't exposed to any of these fields because of the disconnection and segregation of our society. And my hope is groups like this can help kind of bridge that by creating that exposure.
Well, now we have a video question submitted by Science Talent Search alum and Society for Science Board of Trustee member, Dr. Thomas Rosenbaum, president of Caltech.
I'm Thomas Rosenbaum, professor of physics and president of Caltech, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Society for Science. I have been introduced to your work, Professor Chetty, by my son, Michael Rosenbaum, a researcher who uses the tools of economics to try to improve social programs. My question involves metrics. In reading your work on upward mobility, you understandably focus on growth on earnings as a ready metric. Your recent papers on social networks include measures of cohesiveness and civic engagement. What are the prospects for including holistic life outcomes like meaningful social relationships and intellectual engagement? And what are your views on how institutions of higher education can contribute to a community's social connectivity? Thank you.
So that's a very rich and thoughtful question from Dr. Rosenbaum. Let me say two things there. So first, it's absolutely right that we tend to focus in many studies on income as a simple quantitative measure that we can get from things like tax records. But as we were just discussing, Maya, you can see how we're expanding our work to look at outcomes like innovation. We also look at health outcomes. So you can look at data on life expectancy, for example, and do similar analyses. In a nutshell, the way I would summarize a lot of that is things that lead to higher income, not always, but often are associated with improvements in the other outcomes as well. So there's a very strong link in America between life expectancy and income. We show in one of our earlier papers published in JAMA that the richest Americans have life expectancy about 15 years longer than the lowest income Americans. 15 years is an enormous gap, right? And so it's not to say that income is the be all and end all by any means, but it's sort of related to lots of other things that we would view as being important. And increasingly, we can study those other things as well, health, innovation, and so on. There was a second aspect to Dr. Rosenbaum's question, which is the role of institutions of higher education. And there, I think there's a lot to be studied and a lot to be done, where I think we've all had the experience that institutions of higher education can be an incredible pathway to opportunity. I can certainly say myself that the opportunities I had at Harvard were absolutely pivotal in shaping my own life and career. But I think we need to remember that access to those opportunities also tends to be very unequal. At present, there are more kids from the top 1% of the income distribution, that is families making more than $600,000 a year at Harvard, than there are families from the entire bottom half of the income distribution. And so when you have a situation like that, what elite universities and what the higher education system in the US might end up doing more broadly is perpetuating privilege across generations, where kids from the best resourced, highest income families have access to these universities that give them pathways to success, whereas kids from more disadvantaged backgrounds don't have those same opportunities. And so one of the key thrusts of our current research is to try to understand why that's happening, despite the fact that Harvard and many other universities have made an enormous effort to expand financial aid, to increase outreach and so forth. Why is this happening, and what can we do to make our higher education system more of an engine of economic opportunity for all?
Raj, one of the other things about institutions of higher education is that a lot of them are placed in major urban areas or in some places in rural areas, and their commitment to community, right, to their outward community of social, can they play a role in social connectivity and really being part of that exposure paradigm that you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. I think universities can play a big role outside their own gates. And that's something I'm starting to see more conversations about. To take an institution like Harvard, beyond serving a very small number of students who are on campus, in the grand scheme of things, Harvard is not a very big college. How can Harvard have an influence on the surrounding community, or increasingly in the digital world, have an influence that goes well beyond Cambridge, where the institution is physically based? And I think that can come from giving access to kids from a variety of different backgrounds to resources, and importantly, to communities, to learning communities that they may not otherwise have had. I think there's a lot more work to be done there, and there's a lot of exciting potential there.
A couple of rapid fire questions, okay? Tennis or soccer?
Tennis.
Okay. Coffee or tea?
Tea. I actually have only had one cup of coffee in my life.
Okay. So you drink chai, right?
From time to time.
Samosas or pakoras?
Samosas, I'll say.
Samosas. And what's your favorite book?
Favorite book? I will go back to my childhood and say Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which in retrospect, I actually realized is a book about upward mobility. I don't think I had quite figured that out as a kid.
Okay. Your findings have inspired me to reflect on the impact of our own programs, like our Advocate Grant Program, which is a mentorship program, which provides resources and communities to mentors who support students entering our research competitions. We've had great success in the program's 7-year history. 4,000 students have entered science research competitions as a result. However, to what extent do you think programs like mentorship programs or others could truly make a lasting impact on young people and on successfully nurturing innovation?
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I think those kinds of efforts are very valuable. The one thing I would note is we found through various studies that the way in which one intervenes starting early in childhood really is quite important. So the visual I like to keep in my mind is a pipeline that starts from birth and goes to something like age 22 or 23. And everything that's happening in that pipeline from birth till young adulthood really influences how kids do. So when you think about mentorship and science programs targeted, say, at teenagers who may be thinking about these kinds of things, they can add a lot of value. But we find that often kids are on very different trajectories by the time they get to things like high school. And so I think it's very important to think about how we can reach even further back, possibly in collaboration with local schools, to help kids come through that pipeline from the very beginning and not sort of fall off the track before you even have a chance to reach them in high school. So I think it can be
we start at middle school, Raj.
Wonderful.
So we think middle school is absolutely one of those critical places, but so is elementary school. But middle school is where the research shows they just fall. Girls fall and kids of color fall. It's like this. So how do you capture them and keep them on that trajectory? I have a video question from a recent alum, Aaron George. Take a look.
Hello, my name is Aaron George from Austin, Texas. and I had the honor of winning a grand award last year at ISEB 2022 in the category of Biomedical and Health Sciences. My question is for you, Mr. Chetty. They say you learn while you teach. What is one thing you've learned while teaching your students at Harvard University? Thank you, Mr. Ajmera and Mr. Chetty, for your time.
That's an excellent question. So I teach a big class at Harvard now called Using Big Data to Solve Social Problems. And it has about 500 students in a big lecture hall at Harvard. And it's been really fun to teach because it's a way to expose students to the ideas that we're discussing in this conversation, Maya, as well as having, teaching some technical skills in the context of statistics and computer science, and showing how these kinds of scientific tools can be used to tackle social problems that a lot of us are quite concerned about. And so one thing I've learned in the process of teaching that class, I guess I'll give one general example and one specific example. The general example I'll give is, I think the way in which we teach students about our fields has an incredible influence on who is interested and who chooses to pursue those fields. So one of the things I've been heartened by is this class has a 50-50 gender balance and has a much more diverse set of students than economics classes traditionally do, which tend to skew towards men, essentially. And I think that's because many students don't realize economics can be used to study things like racial disparities, inequality, climate change. That's really what I think is exciting about the field, not so much the thinking about predicting the stock market or whatever else people may conceive economics as being about. So that has been instructive to me and has motivated me to try to explain what we do to the broader public, in simpler terms. One very specific lesson of the types of things I think students themselves are discovering. So a factor that I had not paid that much attention to, but turns out to be quite important in explaining differences in economic opportunity, are historical factors related to things like redlining, which limited credit access for Black families in certain neighborhoods in the US. And so we had a student do a very nice paper, basically showed in her own hometown of Richmond, Virginia, the neighborhoods that today, 100 years later, have much better opportunities for Black kids are the ones that were not redlined back in the 1930s when the federal government was making these designations. And so it just shows you how, by working together with our own individual experiences, we can enrich our understanding of how society works in so many ways.
Raj, one of the things we've learned with the research projects through so many years is what we've understood from women and kids of color is that a lot of their research projects deal with things that are dealing with their communities or themselves.
Yeah.
And they tend to they just want to engage in science. They want to engage in the data. That's really interesting with what you've just said about your data class, right? That there's a diversity there because they're wanting to answer questions that relate possibly close to home, as you said about the student from Richmond. So what advice do you have for those who want to delve into big data, right? Like there's a lot of kids out there, a lot of young people, even older, that want that big data is there, whether it's what you're working on or whether it's NASA that's unleashed huge amounts of data. What's your advice on that?
Yeah. So in general, what I tell students is there are technical skills that matter in these kinds of fields. You need to know how to analyze large data sets with modern statistical methods. Could be machine learning, could be quasi-experimental techniques. It could be computer science methods that are useful for actually analyzing enormous data sets. But to me, all of that comes second after asking what is the question that actually inspires you? What is the problem you're trying to solve? It's somewhat easy to acquire methods once you're inspired by a question you're seeking to answer. Certainly for myself, I like to think of myself as wanting to focus on answering certain big picture questions, and then I will go and look for the methods that seem most useful to answer that question, or simply work with people who have expertise that I may not have. I mean, I think we always need to work as a team to solve complicated problems. But I think the way we do good work and the way we ultimately are motivated to stay on track in solving very challenging problems is to start from that basic question and understand how can I contribute to really advancing things in something I care about deeply in my community, in the nation as a whole, in science, and so on.
So, Raj, I want you to imagine you've done this work for the last 10, 15 years, and now you have a philanthropist that says, Raj, we want to give you $10 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Put those philanthropic capital to some solutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Against your data. What would you say to that? Like, what would be maybe 2 or 3 buckets you would maybe strategize around?
Yep. And I'm often asked that question, not just hypothetically, but in practice, but by people who really want to make a difference.
Right.
And so I think I would point to 3 buckets. So the first we already touched upon, which is giving people access to opportunities in different neighborhoods and different communities. So we already spend tons of money as a federal government trying to do this. Can we make those programs more effective by connecting people with mentors, with people who are going to help them actually take advantage of existing programs like we did in the Seattle experiment I described? So think of that as sort of a moving to opportunity desegregation approach. That's one bucket. Another bucket is recognizing not everybody wants to move. You can't possibly move everyone to a different community. So I think we also need to think about how do we go to neighborhoods that currently have lower levels of opportunity. And let me just mention in passing, Maya, anyone can look up for themselves the data that we've put out publicly on something called the Opportunity Atlas. You can go and look in your own city. What are the neighborhoods where we're seeing kids doing really well? Where are the kids where they are not? And so here, what we want to think about is what kinds of investments can we make in the neighborhoods that currently offer poorer opportunities to improve outcomes there? And there are well-demonstrated methods like targeted job training programs, certain types of changes in schools, recruiting more effective teachers, certain types of charter schools that have proven to be fairly effective. There's a suite of tools there that I think can make a difference. And then finally, the third bucket I would be sure to mention is higher education, which we also touched upon. I think there's great potential for our system of higher education to create more pathways to upward mobility, but we're not achieving that at present. And so we need to work on improving access to top universities to a broader range of kids. And we need to improve outcomes at places like community colleges that are currently serving lots of low-income kids, but there are higher rates of non-completion. There are other challenges such that the outcomes don't look all that great at those colleges. And we need to, again, I think through social support, other types of focused interventions, improve outcomes there.
So we have another question from Neha Gupta from the University of Toronto.
Hi, my name is Neha Gupta. I am an ISEF 2021 alumni located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. My question for you is, what is one habit of yours that you would credit your strengths to? Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that's a good question, Neha. I think I would say focus and determination in wanting to go after a well-defined question, coming back to what I was saying earlier, to frame what the question is and then just being tenacious in going after it from many different angles and being willing to take several years to find the data, overcome the numerous obstacles that you anticipated, Maya, legally or otherwise, and ultimately extract something that can be useful for scientific knowledge.
What's keeping you up at night?
I would say knowing that the pandemic, for example, has made all of the issues that we're studying only worse. And so that I think finding solutions to these problems is all the more imperative, not just because the American dream in and of itself is important, but I also think it has very important political implications. Democracy itself, I think, is at some risk at the moment because many people feel disenfranchised. And so I would like to have more answers to the types of questions you raised, Maya, on what can we actually do and what can we do on scale to make a difference. And I think we're starting to get some precise scientific answers, but there's a lot more to be done. If somebody were to ask me, how exactly do we narrow racial disparities? Why do we see Black kids, even growing up in high-income families, having much worse outcomes than white kids growing up in comparable families? I have a couple guesses, but don't really have the answer. And that, I think, prevents us from actually finding a solution. And that's the kind of thing that I think I often lying in bed thinking about, trying to think about how we might figure out those answers.
What are some of the new projects you're working on? Can you just a little bit of light?
So we're going into further depth on a lot of the issues that we've been discussing. For example, in the higher education space, linking data on the admissions records of many colleges to the tax data to see who's getting in and who's not, and why is that, and what might be able to change in the admissions process that could have an impact. We're doing more work trying to study specific place-based policies that invest in certain communities to try to transform them. Federal government has spent billions of dollars on these kinds of programs, but really we don't know if they worked or not, which is kind of amazing. And the fact that we're spending billions on these kinds of things over many, many years. And so we've got a number of studies underway to essentially understand the science of economic opportunity in much greater detail than we've been able to in the past.
I think one of the things I come away with is just this, you said about granularity, about going deep. If we're going to make progress, we have to go deep, right? Scale goes wide, but it doesn't go as deep as we want it to, and it doesn't capture the information we need. But it's also about proximity, frankly, and who we invest in at the local level of really making this change. Because I think it's people at the end of the day, Raj, right? And who we elect, correct? And
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. And I mean, that's what makes it so challenging as well, right? If it was something that you could just address sort of a mechanical way, send everyone a check in the mail with cash, or give everybody access to some program that could just be done uniformly across the United States in a way that would be much simpler than the types of solutions we're starting to seem most impactful, which are these sorts of connections, mentors. That's not something that's easy to just scale and multiply. It matters how you execute that locally, place by place. And it also, from our perspective as scientists, means that we need to have tools to monitor when these programs are actually working and when they're not, because you can't simply multiply them by 100 and expect to see the same effects. And so that's what I think makes these problems so challenging to solve. That's what makes them so interesting from a scientific point of view.
Raj, what an incredible treat and honor to have had a discussion with you today. Our 55 minutes went by very quickly, and I could sit here, have a cup of chai with you and keep talking and asking you a lot more questions, but just want to be able to say thank you from our community to you. But you are part of our community, and we actually take a little bit of credit for who you are and the important work that you do. So thank you. Thank you so much. So before we conclude today's program, I want to share with you all about how community members are helping to support the society. Today kicks off Give to Science Day, a campaign that celebrates our work together to promote science and ensure that every young person has the opportunity to pursue their interest in STEM. This year, Friends of the Society for Science across the country are hosting fundraisers that support our work. Take a moment right now to visit givetoscience.org, read their stories. Please make a donation to Give to Science campaign. All funds will go towards putting the wonder of science in everyone's hands. Thank you so much, Raj. Again, thank you everyone for being here with us today.
Thank you, Maya. My pleasure.
Thank you.